My daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said her entire family would be spending Christmas here at my house. All 30 of them. I just smiled, took a sip of my coffee and told her that was absolutely perfect. I let her. I was going on vacation to Aspen, and she could cook and clean for them herself, because I am not her servant. All the color drained from her face. She turned completely pale. But the real surprise, the one that would leave her and my son entirely broke and homeless, was still to come. Before I dive into this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who mistook your kindness for weakness. My name is Bruce. I am 71 years old, and for 40 years I worked as a structural engineer. I built bridges, commercial high-rises, and parking garages. I know how to calculate weight, how to anticipate stress, and how to recognize when a foundation is crumbling. My wife Diane and I built our dream home in a quiet, affluent suburb of Columbus, Ohio. It is a sprawling 4-bedroom brick colonial sitting on a double lot surrounded by old oak trees. It was our sanctuary. Diane passed away 7 years ago, taking a massive piece of my heart with her, but leaving me with a house full of beautiful memories. I maintained the property meticulously. It was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. That was until 3 years ago when my son Colin and his wife Vanessa knocked on my door with a sob story and a moving truck. Colin is 34 years old. He is my only child, and it pains me to say that somewhere along the line I failed to instill a backbone in him. He married Vanessa 5 years ago. Vanessa is 32, obsessed with social media appearances and living a lifestyle she absolutely cannot afford. 3 years ago, Colin claimed their landlord was raising the rent to an unreasonable rate. They asked if they could move into my spare bedrooms for just 6 months. 6 short months they promised, just long enough to save for a solid down payment on a house of their own. Being a father, I opened my doors. I cleared out 2 guest rooms. I gave them space, and they never left. The contrast in our daily routines was the first crack in the foundation. I am an early riser. Every morning at 5 I am out of bed. I brew a pot of black coffee, read the morning paper, and enjoy the absolute stillness of the dawn. I keep my space clean, organized, and respected. Vanessa and Colin, on the other hand, treat my home like a boutique hotel where the invisible staff is expected to clean up after them. Vanessa never wakes up before 10 in the morning. When she finally emerges, she stumbles into the kitchen, complains if I am making any noise, and brews her expensive, cloying vanilla espresso pods. She takes her cup into the living room, sits on the antique sofa, and leaves her dripping mugs directly on Diane's favorite antique mahogany coffee table. No coaster. No respect. Day after day, I wipe away the water rings, silently absorbing the quiet disrespect that permeates the air of my own home. The resentment truly began to calcify the day Colin brought the new car home. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when a brand new, fully loaded black luxury SUV rolled up my driveway. Colin stepped out of the driver's seat with a smug, arrogant swagger, tossing the keys in his hand. Vanessa rushed out of the front door, squealing and clapping as if they had just won the lottery. I walked out onto the porch, wiping my hands on a towel, and asked him how exactly he managed to afford an $80,000 vehicle while supposedly living rent-free to save for a mortgage. Colin did not even look me in the eye. He just waved his hand dismissively and claimed it was a massive work bonus, a reward for his outstanding performance at the logistics firm where he works in mid-level management. I wanted to believe him. A father always wants to believe his son is succeeding. But structural engineers do not operate on hope. We operate on data. 2 days later, the data presented itself. I was sorting through the mail on this kitchen counter when I noticed a bank statement addressed to both of us. It was for a joint emergency savings account I had opened for Colin when he was just 18 years old. I had seeded it with $30,000, explicitly telling him it was for absolute emergencies only. Medical bills, a sudden job loss, a real crisis. I opened the envelope. The balance was zero. He had completely drained the account to cover the massive down payment and upfront lease costs for that ridiculous SUV. I stood in the kitchen, holding the piece of paper that proved my son was a liar and a thief. A younger, more volatile man might have stormed upstairs, kicked down his bedroom door, and demanded the keys. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I carefully folded the bank statement, walked into my home office, and locked the document in my safe. I watched through the window as Colin proudly polished the hood of his stolen luxury car in my driveway. In that exact moment, my perspective shifted permanently. I no longer looked at Colin as a son who needed guidance. I looked at him as a structural liability. The silent tally of their offenses had officially begun, and I was going to collect every single debt. The escalation of their arrogance reached its peak on a random Tuesday night. I had retired to my study around 8 in the evening, hoping to read a historical biography in peace. Without any warning, the front door swung open, and I heard the loud, obnoxious voices of at least a dozen people. Vanessa had decided to host an impromptu dinner party for her friends. Heavy bass music started pumping through the house, rattling the walls. High heels clicked across the hardwood floors, and the sharp, piercing sound of Vanessa's fake laughter echoed down the hallway. I stayed in my study, ignoring the invasion, hoping they would keep to the dining room. An hour later, the door to my study swung open without a knock. Vanessa stood there in a cocktail dress, holding an empty wine glass. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not apologize for the noise. She looked at me with an entitled smirk and told me her guests were running low on drinks. She explicitly told me to go down to the cellar and bring up 3 bottles of the Good Reserve red wine, as if I were the hired help. She said it loudly, ensuring her friends in the hallway could hear her bossing me around. I looked at her carefully painted face. I closed my book, stood up, and silently walked down to the cellar. I retrieved the wine she demanded, handed it to her without a single word, and walked back into my study, locking the door behind me. I let her have her moment of petty authority. The true breaking point arrived the next morning. I woke up at my usual 5 o'clock and walked into the kitchen. The sight that greeted me was a disaster zone. Half-eaten plates of artisanal cheese and crackers were left rotting on the counters. Empty, sticky wine glasses cluttered the sink. The expensive pots and pans were crusted with burned food and tossed carelessly across the stove. I walked slowly into the living room. The air smelled stale. And there, right in the center of Diane's favorite Persian rug, was a massive dark stain of spilled red wine. It was soaked deep into the fibers left to dry and set overnight. I did not wake them up. I went to the utility closet, retrieved the heavy-duty carpet cleaner, filled it with hot water and solution, and carried it to the living room. I got down on my hands and knees in the quiet dawn. I scrubbed the rug. I cleaned the kitchen. I threw away their garbage. I washed their dishes. Anyone watching might have thought I was a defeated old man, broken and submissive, acting as a maid in a house I owned, but they would be completely wrong. As I scrubbed the last of the wine from the fibers of the rug my wife had loved so much, my mind was perfectly clear. This was not submission. This was the meticulous, calculated sharpening of a blade. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to dismantle their entire lives, and they would not see it coming until the ground completely gave way beneath their feet. The air in Ohio turned bitter and gray by mid-November. The trees in my backyard had shed their final leaves, leaving the branches bare against the freezing wind. Inside my home, I kept the thermostat set to a comfortable temperature, trying to maintain the quiet peace I had carefully built. I had spent the afternoon slow roasting a chicken with root vegetables, a recipe Diane and I used to make together when the weather turned cold. The aroma filled the kitchen, offering a fleeting sense of warmth. Colin and Vanessa arrived downstairs just as I was pulling the roasting pan from the oven. As usual, they had not offered to help cook, nor had they contributed to the groceries. Vanessa marched into the kitchen with her phone glued to her hand, her thumbs tapping furiously against the screen. She sat down at the dining table, not bothering to offer a greeting. Colin trailed behind her, looking exhausted from his middle management job, slumping into the chair next to his wife. I plated the food in silence and set the dishes on the table. We ate for several minutes, with no sound other than the clinking of silverware against porcelain. I preferred the silence to Vanessa complaining about her coworkers or the local barista making her coffee incorrectly. But the silence that evening felt heavy and thick, with an unspoken agenda. Vanessa kept glancing up from her screen, looking at Colin, then back at her phone. She took a sip of her water, cleared her throat, and finally set the device face down on the table. "I am finalizing the holiday itinerary," she said, with her tone casually dismissive, as if she were discussing the weather. "I just wanted to give you a heads up about Christmas this year." I continued cutting my meal, keeping my eyes focused on my plate. "A heads up," I repeated slowly. "Yes," she continued, leaning back in her chair with an air of complete entitlement. "My family usually rents a ski lodge or goes down to a resort, but this year everyone decided they want a traditional, cozy home-style Christmas, so I offered to host them here." I stopped chewing. I placed my fork down on the table. The sheer audacity of the word host echoed in my mind. She was offering to host a gathering in a house she did not own without consulting the man who paid the property taxes. "I see," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "And exactly how many people are we expecting for this cozy gathering?" Vanessa waved her hand in the air, brushing off the question, as if it were a minor detail. "Oh, nothing crazy. Just the immediate, extended family. My parents, my 2 sisters and their husbands, the kids, my Uncle Jack and his new wife, some cousins. It is only about 30 people. They are flying in on the 20th and staying through the day after Christmas. 30 people. For a full week." I let the number sink in. 30 loud, demanding, entitled strangers trampling through my hallways, scuffing the hardwood floors, breaking dishes and treating my home like a free bed and breakfast. My mind instantly calculated the logistics of housing 36 people in a 4-bedroom house. It would be absolute chaos. Before I could even formulate a response, Vanessa reached into the pocket of her designer cardigan. She pulled out a thick, neatly folded stack of heavy cardstock paper. She did not hand it to me. She slid it across the polished surface of the dining table, letting it come to a stop right next to my dinner plate. "Since I am going to be entirely too busy handling the aesthetic and the decor," she said, with her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I need you to handle the shopping this week." I looked down at the papers. I did not touch them immediately. I just stared at the neatly printed lines of text. "It is quite a list," she added, crossing her arms over her chest. "But we want everything to be perfect. My parents have very specific tastes. You know how they are." I picked up the stack of paper. It was not a normal grocery list. A normal grocery list contains milk, eggs, bread, and maybe a turkey or a ham for the holiday dinner. This was a sprawling, multi-page manifesto of luxury consumption. I scanned the first page. It demanded 3 massive prime rib roasts exclusively from a high-end organic butcher downtown. The second page was entirely dedicated to dairy and charcuterie. It listed imported French brie, aged Italian Gouda, artisanal water crackers, and fresh black truffles. I flipped to the final page where she had outlined the beverages. She had requested 4 cases of a specific vintage champagne, a brand I knew retailed for over $100 a bottle. She had also listed premium Scotch craft beers and imported sparkling waters. I did an incredibly quick mental calculation. The food alone would cost thousands of dollars. The alcohol would double that number. She was sliding a bill for roughly $5,000 across my dining table and ordering me to pay it. I looked up from the list, meeting her gaze. "You want me to purchase all of this?" I asked with my voice dangerously calm. "Well, yes," she sighed, rolling her eyes as if I were being intentionally dense. "I literally just told you I do not have the time. I have to coordinate the matching family pajamas, hire a photographer for Christmas Eve, and figure out the floral arrangements for the dining room. I am absolutely exhausted just thinking about it." Colin finally decided to speak up. His voice was soft and placating, the sound of a man who had completely surrendered his dignity. "Come on, Dad," he mumbled, refusing to make eye contact with me. "It would be a huge help. You have the big trunk in your car for the groceries, and you have all that free time during the day. It is the holidays. We should all pitch in. Pitch in." The phrase tasted like ash in my mouth. They were not asking me to pitch in. They were ordering me to finance and execute a luxury banquet for people I barely knew and actively disliked. Vanessa and her parents were just as arrogant and superficial as each other. The last time they visited, her father had criticized the brand of coffee I served while sitting on a sofa I paid for. I looked at Vanessa. She was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. She honestly believed she had won. She believed that because I had remained silent for the past 3 years, because I had scrubbed the wine stains and paid the utility bills without shouting, that I was a broken, submissive old man. She thought I was just a convenient wallet and an unpaid servant. I held the multi-page grocery list in my hands. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the weight of their profound disrespect. I could have thrown it back in her face. I could have shouted. I could have ordered them to pack their bags and leave my house that very night. But an explosive reaction would only give them ammunition to call me unreasonable or bitter. A structural engineer knows that the most devastating collapses do not happen with a loud explosion. They happen in absolute silence, when the support beams are quietly removed one by one until the weight of the structure simply crushes itself. I folded the list neatly along its original creases. I slipped it into the breast pocket of my shirt. I looked at Vanessa, and then I looked at Colin. I let a slow, compliant smile spread across my face. "I understand," I said smoothly. "You are completely right. You have a lot on your plate with the decorations. I will take care of the shopping." Vanessa beamed, letting out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief. "Thank goodness," she said, picking up her phone again. "Make sure you go to the butcher by Thursday. They run out of the good cuts if you wait until the weekend." I nodded once. I picked up my empty plate, carried it to the sink, and washed it quietly. I walked out of the kitchen, feeling their eyes on my back, completely unaware that they had just handed me the very tools I needed to dismantle their entire lives. I stood at the kitchen sink, letting the warm water wash over my hands. The heavy cardstock of the grocery list was tucked safely in my breast pocket, pressing against my chest like a physical manifestation of their audacity. I thought the conversation was over. I thought the demands had reached their peak for the evening. I reached for a dish towel, drying my hands slowly, letting the rhythmic motion ground me. But the sound of Vanessa tapping her manicured nails against the dining table broke the brief silence. She was not finished. "Oh, there is one more logistical thing we need to sort out," she said, her voice completely devoid of any hesitation. "It is about the sleeping arrangements." I did not turn around immediately. I carefully folded the dish towel and draped it over the handle of the oven. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever fresh indignity she had conjured in her mind. When I finally turned to face her, she was already scrolling through her phone again, not even bothering to look at me while she spoke. "So I have mapped out where everyone is going to sleep," she continued, waving a hand vaguely in the direction of the hallway. "The kids are going to be in sleeping bags in the living room. My sister and her husband are taking the east guest room. My brother is taking the west guest room. The cousins are going to be on air mattresses in my home office." She paused, finally looking up from her screen. She pressed her lips together in a tight, thin line. "But that leaves my parents. And frankly, Bruce, the guest rooms just are not suitable for them. They are getting older. My mother has a bad back, and she cannot be expected to walk down the hall to use a shared bathroom in the middle of the night. It is just not hospitable. We are hosting them, and they need their own private attached bathroom. They need the master suite." The words hung in the air. The master suite. My bedroom. The room I had shared with Diane for 40 years. It was not just a place to sleep. It was a sanctuary built on 4 decades of marriage, It was the room where Diana and I had stayed up late into the night, discussing Colin's future when he was just a little boy. It was the room where we had laughed, where we had cried, and ultimately it was the room where I had held Diane's hand as she took her final breath. Everything in that room was sacred to me. The heavy oak dresser we had bought at an estate sale on our 5th anniversary. The reading chair by the bay window, where Diane used to sit with her morning tea. The space was a living museum of my life with the woman I loved, and Vanessa wanted me to vacate it, so her parents could treat it like a complimentary suite at a bed and breakfast. I stared at her, trying to process the absolute magnitude of her entitlement. "I see," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "And if your parents are occupying my bedroom, where exactly do you expect me to sleep for the duration of this week-long visit?" Vanessa did not even blink. "Well, I was thinking you could just take the pull-out couch down in the basement. It is only for a few days, and you are an early riser anyway, so you will not be in anyone's way down there. It just makes the most logistical sense." The basement. She wanted to banish me to the unfinished basement. In the middle of an Ohio winter, the basement was essentially a concrete box where I stored holiday decorations, old paint cans, and seasonal tools. It was drafty, damp, and perpetually cold, and the pull-out couch she was referring to was a dilapidated piece of furniture I had bought 30 years ago for a hunting cabin. The mattress was paper-thin, stained with age, and smelled faintly of mildew. Worse than that, it had a broken metal spring right in the center that dug sharply into the back of anyone unfortunate enough to lie on it. She was exiling me to a freezing concrete cell to sleep on a broken metal spring while strangers slept in the bed I had shared with my deceased wife. I felt a slow, cold fire ignite in the very center of my chest. It was not the hot, blinding rage of a younger man. It was the precise, absolute clarity of an engineer watching a bridge snap under too much pressure. There was no going back from this. The line had not just been crossed, it had been completely obliterated. But before I responded, I turned my gaze away from Vanessa and looked directly at my son. Colin was sitting right there at the table. He had heard every single word. He knew what that bedroom meant to me. He knew how much I still grieved his mother. He knew the condition of that freezing, unfinished basement. I stared at him, waiting. I was giving him one final opportunity to be a man. One last chance to locate his spine, to stand up and tell his wife that she had gone too far. I wanted him to say no. I needed him to say that his father would not be treated like a stray dog in his own home. Colin felt the weight of my stare. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his shoulders hunching forward. He picked up his fork and began pushing a leftover piece of roasted carrot around his plate. He refused to meet my eyes. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. The tension in the room was palpable, vibrating against the walls. I waited. I watched him physically shrink under the pressure of his wife's dominating presence and his own profound cowardice. Finally, Colin opened his mouth. His voice was a pathetic, weak mumble. "Come on, Dad," he mumbled, staring fixedly at the scratches on his ceramic plate. "It is really not that big of a deal. It is only for a week, Dad. Just let them have the room. It will make things easier for everyone." "It is only for a week, Dad." Those 7 words sealed his fate. In that exact moment, the last remaining thread of paternal obligation I felt toward my son completely dissolved. I looked at the top of his bowed head and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no disappointment, just the cold, sterile detachment you feel when you decide to throw away a broken tool that can no longer be fixed. He was no longer a son to protect. He was just another squatter residing in my property. I looked back at Vanessa. She was practically glowing with victory. She had tested the ultimate boundary and met no resistance. She had proven to herself that she was the absolute ruler of my home, and that my son would happily act as her foot soldier. I let out a slow, steady breath. I smoothed the wrinkles from my shirt. I looked at the 2 of them sitting at the dining table. I had purchased the table where I had fed Colin every night of his childhood. I forced my lips into a polite, agreeable smile. You make a very practical point, Vanessa. I said, my voice smooth and untroubled. Logistically speaking, it does make sense. I would not want your parents to be uncomfortable walking down the hallway. I will clear out my personal items from this master suite this weekend and set up my things in the basement. Vanessa clapped her hands together, a sharp ringing sound of triumph. Perfect, she chirped, sliding her phone back into her pocket. I knew you would understand, Bruce. I am going to text my mom right now and let her know she gets the big room with the jacuzzi tub. She is going to be so thrilled. Colin finally looked up from his plate, offering me a weak, apologetic smile. Thanks, Dad, he whispered. I appreciate it. I did not say you are welcome. I simply turned my back to them and walked out of the kitchen. I moved down the hallway, my footsteps silent against the hardwood floor. I reached the door of my private study, the only room in the house I kept strictly locked. I turned the key, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped inside the dark, quiet space. I did not turn on the main overhead light. I walked over to my heavy oak desk and switched on the small brass reading lamp. I sat down in my leather chair, staring at the phone sitting on the edge of the desk. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully reduced me to a ghost haunting the basement of my own home. But as I reached out and picked up the phone receiver, I knew the truth. They had not won anything. They had simply accelerated their own destruction. I dialed the direct private number for Stanley, my estate attorney, and listened to the line ring. It was time to initiate the collapse. The glass of ice water sat on the table, condensing in the warm air of the kitchen. I reached for it slowly, extending my arm with deliberate control. My fingers wrapped around the cold surface, feeling the moisture against my aged skin. I lifted it to my lips and took a long, slow sip. The icy liquid slid down my throat, cooling the intense fire that was threatening to burn through my ribs. An untrained man, an emotional man, would have slammed the glass down on the table right then and there. He would have raised his voice, turning red in the face, shouting about respect and boundaries and property rights. He would have demanded gratitude for the roof over their heads. But shouting implies a loss of control. Shouting signals to your opponent that they have successfully breached your defenses and found your weak point. I am not an untrained man. I am an engineer. I know exactly how to manage immense pressure without showing a single crack on the surface. I lowered the glass, placing it gently back onto the wooden table, making absolutely no sound. I looked at the multi-page grocery list resting near my plate. I reached out, picked it up, folded it neatly, and slid it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. I looked across the table at the woman who had invaded my home and the son who had facilitated the invasion. I let my facial muscles relax. I softened the corners of my eyes. I pulled my lips back into a warm, compliant, completely fabricated smile. It was a smile of total submission. I understand, Vanessa, I said, keeping my tone incredibly gentle and accommodating. You are right. Your parents are older, and they should not have to navigate a dark hallway at night. The master suite is the most logical choice for their comfort. I will begin packing up my personal belongings tomorrow morning, so the room is spotless for their arrival. I can easily make do with the pull-out couch in the basement. It will give you all the space you need to host a proper family Christmas. I will also take care of this shopping list. You focus on the decorations and making the house look festive for your relatives. The transformation in their body language was immediate and pathetic to witness. Vanessa actually let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief, her rigid shoulders dropping as she leaned back in her dining chair. A smug, triumphant glow washed over her face, illuminating her features. She looked at me not with any sense of gratitude or appreciation, but with the condescending approval a master gives to a well-behaved dog. She truly believed she had won the war. She believed that her sheer force of will and relentless entitlement had finally broken the stubborn old man and turned him into a docile, subservient butler. Beside her, Colin visibly melted into his chair. The nervous tension drained from his spine, and he offered me a weak, cowardly grin. Thanks, Dad, he mumbled, pushing his empty plate away. We really appreciate it. It is just going to make the holidays so much less stressful for everyone. They had completely miscalculated the situation. They mistook my silence for weakness. They assumed my compliance meant I had surrendered my dignity and accepted my new role at the bottom of the household hierarchy. They did not realize that a man who has spent 40 years calculating the exact breaking point of steel beams and concrete pillars does not simply collapse under the weight of an entitled daughter-in-law. He shifts the load. He reinforces his foundation, and then he quietly removes the supports holding up the opposing structure. They thought they were brilliant strategists conquering my territory room by room, but they were just two arrogant squatters dancing blindly on a trapdoor that I was about to open. I stood up from the table, picking up my empty dinner plate and carrying it to the sink. I washed it quietly under the running water. Listening to Vanessa already chattering to Colin about ordering matching silk pajamas for her sisters and nephews. She was already planning how to rearrange the heavy antique furniture in my bedroom to better suit her parents' modern tastes. I dried my hands on a cotton towel, folded it neatly, and hung it over the oven handle. Have a good evening, you two, I said softly, without turning around to look at them. I walked out of the kitchen and moved down the long, dimly lit hallway toward my private study. The house was quiet in this wing, shielded from the obnoxious drone of Vanessa complaining about her holiday stress. I passed the framed photographs lining the walls, pictures of Diane smiling radiantly on our back porch, pictures of a young Colin riding a wooden bicycle I had built for him with my own hands, pictures of a family that no longer existed except in fading ink and glossy paper. I did not feel sad looking at them. I felt a profound sense of absolute clarity. I reached the heavy, solid oak door of my study. It was the only room in the entire house where Vanessa was strictly forbidden to enter, and she knew I kept it locked at all times. I pulled the heavy brass key from my pocket, inserted it into the lock, and turned it slowly. The satisfying metallic click of the tumbler sliding into place was the only sound in the corridor. I stepped inside the dark room and firmly pushed the door shut behind me, locking it securely from the inside. The study was cool and smelled faintly of old paper, cedar wood, and leather. I walked over to my large mahogany desk and switched on the green glass banker lamp. A soft pool of yellow light spilled across the polished wood surface, illuminating the neat stacks of engineering blueprints and financial ledgers. Right there in the exact center of the desk sat my leather-bound checkbook. It was exactly where I always kept it. Normally, when faced with an unexpected expense or a sudden crisis for Colin, I would sit down heavily in my chair, open that book, and write a massive check to make his problem magically go away. I had done it for his out-of-state college tuition. I had done it for his first car when he wrecked his starter vehicle. I had done it for his extravagant destination wedding to Vanessa. The checkbook was the ultimate symbol of my infinite paternal patience and enabling behavior. I stood there staring down at the worn leather cover. My hand hovered over it for a fraction of a second. A ghost of a habit urging me to just pay for the groceries and keep the peace for one more holiday season. Then I slowly pulled my hand back and curled my fingers into a tight fist. I was done writing checks. I was done financing my own disrespect and paying for my own humiliation. I walked past the checkbook, entirely leaving it untouched in the pool of yellow light. Instead, I reached for the heavy black rotary telephone sitting on the far corner of the desk. I did not need to look up the number in my address book. I had it memorized for over 20 years. It was the direct private line for Stanley. Stanley was not a warm family friend. He was not a comforting man who offered a shoulder to cry on. He was my estate attorney, and he was arguably the most ruthless corporate lawyer in the state of Ohio. Stanley specialized in high-net-worth asset protection, ironclad blind trusts, and brutal property severances. He was a cold, calculating shark in a custom-tailored suit, and he had spent the last 3 years repeatedly advising me to cut Colin off financially before they bled me dry. I had always resisted his advice, telling Stanley that Colin just needed a little more time to mature and find his footing. But time was officially up. I picked up the heavy receiver and dialed the sequence of numbers, listening to the mechanical whir of the rotary dial spinning back into place. The line rang twice before a sharp, gravelly voice answered on the other end, cutting through the static. Stanley speaking, the voice barked. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold, clinical precision of a master engineer preparing to detonate a condemned building. "Stanley, it is Bruce," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady pitch that echoed in the quiet study. "You were right about the boy. I need you to draft the severances immediately. We are tearing the whole thing down." The heavy brass key sat cold in my pocket as I turned back to my desk. I had just hung up the phone with Stanley, and the silence in my study felt absolute. It was the kind of quiet that follows a major decision. I did not feel a trace of guilt or hesitation. I pulled my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and sat down in front of my computer. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across the mahogany wood. I opened my internet browser and navigated to the portal for my primary banking institution. For over a decade, I had managed my finances with the exact same rigor I applied to designing steel support columns. Every dollar was accounted for, and every expense was justified. But for the last 3 years, I had allowed a catastrophic leak to form in my own financial foundation. That leak was my son Colin and his wife Vanessa. Tonight I was sealing it permanently. I typed in my master password and watched the dashboard load. The screen populated with a long list of checking and savings accounts. My eyes drifted immediately to the joint checking account I had opened for Colin when he graduated from college. At the time, it was meant to be a transition account to help him pay for his first apartment and buy a reliable vehicle. It was supposed to be a temporary bridge to adulthood. Instead, it had become a permanent crutch. I clicked on the account details and scanned the recent transaction history. It was a pathetic record of an overgrown boy refusing to stand on his own 2 feet. There were expensive dinners at downtown steakhouses. There were monthly subscriptions to luxury grooming boxes and premium car wash services for a leased vehicle he could not actually afford. He used this account as his personal slush fund, knowing I would automatically transfer funds to keep it from overdrawing. Every dollar in those accounts represented hours of my life. It represented the long nights I spent drafting structural blueprints and the early mornings I spent driving to construction sites in the freezing rain. It represented the vacation Diane and I had sacrificed so we could build a secure future for our family. I was not going to let a spoiled woman and a cowardly boy squander the legacy of my hard work on vanity purchases. The money was mine, and I was taking it back. I moved my cursor up to the Account Management tab. The website prompted me with a security warning asking if I was certain I wanted to remove an authorized user. I did not even blink. I clicked the button to confirm. Just like that, Colin was entirely disconnected from the primary wealth I had spent a lifetime building. I repeated the process for the backup savings account and the shared emergency fund. I revoked his transfer privileges. I changed the routing passwords. With a few simple clicks of a computer mouse, I effectively erased the invisible safety net that had been catching my son every time he decided to jump without a parachute. He was now financially weightless and entirely on his own. It was a strangely liberating feeling. For years, I had carried the burden of his financial incompetence, telling myself that a good father always provides. But a good father also knows when to stop providing poison to a sick patient. Free money was the poison that had stunted his growth, and I was cutting off the supply. Once Colin was isolated, I turned my attention to a much more parasitic problem. I opened a new tab and logged into my premium credit card portal. When Vanessa and Colin first moved in under the guise of saving money, Vanessa had politely requested a supplementary credit card. She told me it was strictly for household groceries and cleaning supplies. She claimed it would be easier than asking me for cash every time she went to the supermarket to buy milk or laundry detergent. Being a gracious host, I had agreed and ordered a card with her name printed under my primary account. I had placed a very generous limit on it, trusting her to behave like a responsible adult. I clicked into the transaction history for her specific card and felt a cold smile pull at the corners of my mouth. Vanessa had a very loose definition of household groceries. The ledger was a rolling receipt of sheer vanity and unchecked consumerism. There were charges for expensive nail salons, premium skincare boutiques, and upscale department stores. Just last week, she had charged over $400 at a designer shoe outlet. Earlier in the month, there was a massive bill from a luxury day spa where she had apparently treated herself and a friend to a full day of massages and facials. I scrolled through pages of these transactions. She was using my money to fund a lifestyle she desperately wanted to project to her friends on social media. I suppose she thought I simply paid the bulk total at the end of the month without reviewing the itemized breakdown. She assumed I was a foolish old man who did not understand how to navigate a digital banking statement. She was terribly wrong. I reviewed her spending patterns, noting the specific days and times she usually went on her shopping sprees. I hovered my mouse over the option to immediately freeze and cancel her supplementary card. But an engineer does not simply drop a wrecking ball without planning the exact trajectory of the collapse. If I canceled the card tonight, she would receive a digital notification or an email alert by morning. She would have time to adjust her plans, time to confront me, and time to formulate a new strategy to extract money from her husband. She would simply ask Colin for his credit card, or she would throw a tantrum and demand I reinstate her privileges before her family arrived. I wanted her to feel the full, unmitigated impact of her financial reality in the most public way possible. I wanted the floor to drop out from beneath her exactly when she was leaning her entire weight upon it. I navigated away from the immediate cancellation button and opened the advanced security settings. This particular premium card offered a suite of granular controls for managing supplementary users. It was a feature designed for wealthy parents to control their dependent children. But it worked perfectly for my current situation. I set a highly specific lock on her card. I programmed the system to automatically decline any transaction exceeding $50. Then I scheduled a complete hard cancellation of the physical card to trigger in exactly 48 hours. It would coincide perfectly with the timeline she had given me for the massive holiday grocery shopping trip. I knew exactly how Vanessa operated. She would wait until the very last minute to secure the imported cheeses, the prime rib, and the expensive champagne. She would march into the most exclusive grocery store in town, pile her cart high with luxury items, and saunter up to the register, expecting my plastic card to absorb the financial blow. By programming the cancellation on a time delay, I was ensuring that her humiliation would be absolute and inescapable. The card would decline while she stood in a long line of wealthy holiday shoppers. She would be forced to pull out her own credit cards, the ones carrying horrific interest rates and massive balances. She would have to drain her own accounts to feed the 30 relatives she had so graciously invited to my home. I leaned back in my leather chair and listened to the quiet hum of my computer tower. The glowing screen was the only source of light in the room, casting long shadows against the bookshelves. I had just dismantled their entire financial ecosystem, without raising my voice, without slamming a single door, and without giving them any warning. I had removed the pillars, the beams, and the foundation. The only thing keeping their lives standing right now was the sheer momentum of their own ignorance. They were currently sleeping upstairs, completely unaware that their luxury lifestyle had just been terminated. The invisible walls of their false reality were gone. I closed the laptop, folded my reading glasses, and turned off the green glass banker lamp. The study faded into total darkness, but I had never seen the future more clearly. Tomorrow I would begin the physical extraction. I would start packing away my life, packing away the memories of Diane, and preparing for my permanent departure. I sat in the dark for a few more minutes, letting the silence wash over me. For the first time in 3 years, I felt a profound sense of peace. I was no longer a victim in my own home. I was the architect of their impending ruin. The morning sun barely pierced the heavy gray clouds as I watched Colin and Vanessa back out of the driveway. Their luxury vehicle crunched over the frosted gravel, disappearing down the suburban street. The moment the taillights vanished, I locked the front door. The house fell into a deep, familiar silence. For 3 years, I had spent my days avoiding the chaotic mess they left behind, retreating to my study or the garden. But today, my routine fundamentally shifted. I was no longer a retired engineer passing the time in his old home. I was a man executing a meticulous strategic extraction. I had exactly 3 weeks until the holiday invasion, and I needed every single hour. I started in the master bedroom, the sanctuary Vanessa had so casually demanded I surrender. Standing in the center of the room, I looked at the life Diane and I had built together. To an ordinary person, packing up 40 years of memories would be an emotional nightmare. It would involve crying over old photograph albums and clinging to sentimental objects. But I had already shed my tears for Diane 7 years ago. I knew that she was not in the walls of this house. She was not in the expensive hardwood floors or the vaulted ceilings. Her memory lived inside me. The objects we collected were just material possessions, but they were my material possessions, and I refused to let a pack of entitled strangers mistreat them. I retrieved a stack of heavy-duty moving boxes I had hidden in the back of my closet. I began with the valuables. Diane had a beautiful collection of antique jewelry and delicate porcelain figurines she had sourced from estate sales across the country. I wrapped each piece carefully in thick layers of bubble wrap, packing them tightly so they would not shift during transit. I moved to the walls, taking down the original oil paintings we had purchased on our 10th anniversary trip to the coast. I emptied the safe in my study, transferring the deeds, the birth certificates, the bonds, and the irreplaceable family documents into a secure, locked briefcase. An extraction of this magnitude required absolute secrecy. If Vanessa walked into the house and saw bare walls and empty shelves, she would immediately suspect something was wrong. She would throw a fit, demand answers, and potentially try to claim my belongings as part of the household. So I approached the problem like a structural illusionist. An engineer knows that as long as the facade looks intact, people rarely inspect the foundation. Over the next few days, I visited several local thrift stores and cheap discount shops on the other side of town. I bought terrible generic landscape prints wrapped in flimsy plastic frames. I bought mass-produced ceramic vases and cheap glass bowls. When I took down one of Diane's beautiful oil paintings, I immediately hung a worthless discount print in its exact place. When I packed away her heavy silver tea set, I replaced it with a polished tin knockoff that looked shiny enough from a distance. I arranged the decoys with absolute precision, recreating the general aesthetic of the rooms. The illusion was flawlessly executed. Vanessa was an incredibly superficial woman. She only looked at the surface of things, never possessing the depth to examine the details. She walked past the fake paintings and the cheap ceramic vases every single evening, completely oblivious to the fact that the real treasure had been quietly evacuated. She was too busy scrolling on her phone and complaining about her coworkers to notice that the soul of the house was slowly being drained away. My daily operation followed a strict schedule. I packed and swapped items from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. At 3:30, I loaded the sealed boxes into the trunk of my reliable sedan. I drove across town to a high-end climate-controlled storage facility where I had rented a large secure unit under a corporate alias. The facility required dual passcode entry and biometric scanning, ensuring that no one could ever track my assets. I stacked the heavy cardboard boxes inside the metal unit, organizing them with mathematical efficiency. Every trip I made felt like carrying a piece of my freedom across the finish line. By the second week, the house was essentially a hollow shell. The heavy oak furniture remained, but the drawers were entirely empty. The closets held only the clothes I needed for the next 2 weeks. Everything else, my winter coats, my formal suits, my vintage watch collection, was sitting safely in the storage unit. The physical weight of the house grew lighter with every passing day. One Tuesday afternoon, I was taping up a medium-sized box in the living room when the front door unexpectedly swung open. Vanessa had decided to come home early from her part-time job. I did not panic. I did not rush to hide the packing tape. I simply stood up and wiped my hands on my jeans, maintaining a calm, relaxed posture. She walked into the living room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She paused, dropping her expensive handbag onto an armchair, and looked at the cardboard box at my feet. She raised an eyebrow, placing her hands on her hips. I offered her a polite, exhausted smile. I told her I was just trying to get a head start on clearing out some of the old clutter before her parents arrived. I explained that I wanted to make sure they had plenty of space in the closets and that the house felt open and welcoming for the holidays. Her suspicious expression instantly melted into a beaming, arrogant smile. She actually clapped her hands together, thrilled by my apparent subservience. She told me that was a fantastic idea. She said she had been meaning to tell me that the house felt a little too cluttered with old junk anyway. She praised me for finally taking some initiative and making the place presentable for her relatives. She even suggested I pack up some of the books in the hallway because her mother hated the smell of old paper. I nodded agreeably. I told her I would take care of it right away. I watched her walk up the stairs, humming a cheerful tune, completely satisfied with her total dominance over my life. She honestly believed I was boxing up my own history just to please her arrogant mother. It took every ounce of my willpower not to laugh out loud in the empty living room. She was handing me the perfect alibi on a silver platter. My covert extraction was no longer a secret operation. It was an officially sanctioned household chore. The final week of packing was almost effortless. Since I had Vanessa's explicit permission to remove clutter, I no longer had to hide the boxes. I carried them right out the front door in broad daylight. I packed up my entire workshop in the garage, leaving only a few rusted screwdrivers and empty paint cans. I emptied the kitchen cabinets of the good crystal and the expensive silverware, leaving behind only the cheap, everyday plates and mismatched forks. If 30 people were going to descend on this house, they could eat off generic ceramic and drink from basic glass. I was not leaving a single item of value for them to scratch, chip, or steal. On the final trip to the storage unit, I stood in front of the rolling metal door and looked at the neatly stacked columns of my life. 40 years of hard work, of marriage, of raising a child, all safely contained within those corrugated cardboard walls. The unit was cool, dry, and perfectly organized. I pulled the heavy metal door down and secured it with a heavy steel padlock. When I drove back to the house that evening, the structure looked exactly the same from the outset. The brick facade was sturdy. The lawn was neat, but as I walked through the front door and stepped into the foyer, the air felt different. The acoustics had changed. The house sounded slightly hollow, echoing with the emptiness I had meticulously created. It was no longer a home. It was just a building. It was a perfectly staged movie set, waiting for the final act of a disaster film. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a simple glass of water. The trap was set, the valuables were secure, and the foundation was completely severed. All I had to do now was wait for the occupants to pull the final lever. The steakhouse downtown was exactly the kind of establishment Colin and Vanessa would post pictures of online but could never actually afford. The lighting was incredibly dim, casting long shadows across the dark mahogany-paneled walls and the heavy leather booths. The air smelled of aged beef, roasted garlic, and very expensive scotch. It was a place where quiet conversations moved millions of dollars across tables before the appetizers even arrived. I handed my winter coat to the host and walked toward the private corner booth where Stanley was already waiting. Stanley did not look like a man who spent his days filing paperwork. He looked like a predator resting in a tailored Italian suit. He had a glass of neat whiskey in one hand and a thick manila folder resting on the table in front of him. He did not smile when I sat down. Stanley and I had moved past polite pleasantries decades ago. We respected each other because we both operated entirely on logic and flawless execution. I ordered a glass of water and a bone in ribeye. I was not drinking alcohol. I needed my mind functioning with absolute mathematical precision. Stanley took a slow sip of his drink and tapped his manicured finger against the thick folder. He looked at me with his piercing gray eyes. "You know, Bruce," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "I have been your attorney for a very long time. I have watched you build your wealth, and I have watched you protect your family. But I must admit, I was beginning to think you would never actually make this call. I was starting to believe you were going to let that boy bleed you entirely dry." I unfolded my linen napkin and placed it on my lap. "A structural collapse is a matter of timing, Stanley," I replied. "If you detonate the charges too early, the building falls the wrong way and damages the surrounding properties. You have to wait until the internal load is perfectly balanced before you pull the final pin." Stanley let out a short, harsh bark of laughter. He appreciated the metaphor. He slid the manila folder across the smooth wooden table. "Let us talk about the load," then he said. "For the past 5 years, a luxury commercial real estate developer has been relentlessly pursuing your property. They have sent letters, they have called my office, and they have made increasingly desperate cash offers. Your double lot sits on the exact intersection they need to complete a massive zoning block. They want to tear down your home and build a highly exclusive boutique condominium complex for wealthy retirees." I was absolutely correct. Every few months, a glossy envelope would arrive in my mailbox offering me an astronomical sum of money to vacate the premises. I had always thrown those letters directly into the fireplace. I had always told Stanley to reject their offers without even looking at the numbers. To me, that property was not a financial asset. It was the physical manifestation of my life with Diane. It was the garden she planted. It was the patio we built. It was sacred ground. But sitting in the dim light of the steakhouse, I realized something profound. The sacred ground had been desecrated by disrespect. The garden was just dirt. The patio was just concrete. Diane was not there anymore. The only things left in that house were 2 greedy squatters and a looming invasion of 30 arrogant strangers. I opened the folder. The contract was thick, filled with dense legal terminology that would confuse an ordinary man. But I had spent 40 years reading municipal building codes and union contracts. I understood exactly what I was looking at. The developer was offering millions of dollars in a pure cash transaction. There were no financing contingencies. There were no structural inspections required because they intended to bulldoze the entire structure into the ground anyway. It was the cleanest, most lucrative exit strategy a man could ever ask for. I read through the standard clauses, noting the purchase price. It was enough money to buy a luxury penthouse anywhere in the world and still have millions left over to generate compounding interest. But the money was merely a pleasant side effect. The true value of this contract was the absolute unmitigated destruction of Vanessa and Colin's false reality. I flipped to the second section of the document where the dates and transfer logistics were outlined. This was the critical junction. I looked up at Stanley. "The financial terms are acceptable," I said, keeping my voice entirely level. "But the execution timeline must be modified. I have very specific parameters for the handover." Stanley leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Name your terms," he said. "The developer is so desperate to secure this parcel, they will agree to practically anything you demand." "I need the final closing date to be scheduled for December 26th, I told him. "I want to remain the legal owner of the property through the Christmas holiday. But the moment the clock strikes midnight on the 26th, the title must officially transfer to their corporate holding company. They must assume absolute legal possession of the physical structure and the land." Stanley narrowed his eyes, processing the specific date. He knew exactly what I was doing. He knew Vanessa had invited her entire extended family to occupy the house for the holiday week. A slow, dangerous smile crept across his face. Considered it done, he murmured, making a quick notation on his legal pad. What else? The utilities. I continued, locking eyes with him. This is the most crucial structural component. I want my name completely removed from the water, gas, and electricity accounts. I want those accounts closed and fully transferred to the developer's corporate management division on the morning of December 23rd. I want it stipulated in this contract that the developer assumes all responsibility for the utilities 3 days prior to the final property handover. Stanley stopped writing. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of professional awe and genuine shock. Bruce, he said softly, if we transfer the utilities to a commercial demolition company on December 23rd, they will not keep the heat running. Corporate protocol for a condemned structure is an immediate hard shut-off. They will terminate the gas and the power to prevent any liability before the bulldozers arrive. You will be subjecting the occupants to an absolute freeze right in the middle of an Ohio winter. I picked up the heavy silver pen resting beside the contract. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling the cold metal against my skin. I am well aware of corporate demolition protocols, Stanley. I replied, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. I am not subjecting them to anything. I am simply removing my financial support. If they wish to host 30 people for a luxury holiday, they are more than welcome to figure out how to keep them warm. I will not be there. Stanley let out a low whistle. It was a masterpiece of legal warfare. By transferring the utility accounts to a faceless corporation, I was completely removing myself from the equation. When the heat inevitably died and the pipes froze, Vanessa and Colin would not be able to call the gas company to turn it back on. The utility provider would simply tell them that they were not the authorized property owners and that the accounts had been flagged for demolition. They would be trapped in a freezing dark house with 30 furious relatives and absolutely no legal recourse to fix the problem. They would be forced to face the exact reality of their situation. They owned nothing. They controlled nothing. They were just guests who had overstayed their welcome. I clicked the silver pen open. I turned to the final page of the contract where the signature lines waited. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single pang of regret or nostalgia. I placed the pen to the heavy paper and signed my name with firm, deliberate strokes. I initialed the writers. I signed the transfer authorizations. With every stroke of ink, I severed another tie to the parasitic life I had been tolerating. Our steaks arrived shortly after the final document was signed. The waiter placed the sizzling cuts of meat on the table, filling the air with the scent of rosemary and butter. We ate in comfortable, companionable silence. The deal was done. The trap was perfectly assembled, and the timer was ticking down. As we finished our meal, Stanley gathered the signed documents and placed them safely back into his leather briefcase. He looked at me across the table, raising his glass of whiskey in a silent toast. It has been a pleasure doing business with you, Bruce, he said. The developer will be thrilled. The utility transfer will be executed precisely on the 23rd, and the property manager will conduct a final walk-through on the 24th to verify the structure is secure for demolition. I wiped my mouth with the linen napkin and placed it on the table. I pictured the property manager arriving on Christmas Eve, clipboard in hand, expecting an empty house only to find Vanessa, Colin, and 30 freezing relatives huddled in the dark. It would be the final catastrophic failure of their false kingdom. I stood up from the booth, dropping enough cash on the table to cover the entire meal and a very generous tip. Thank you, Stanley, I said, buttoning my coat. I have a flight to Aspen to catch in a few weeks, and I have one final grocery list to ignore. The 20th of December arrived with a bitter, biting wind that rattled the window panes of the house. Outside, the sky was a flat, unforgiving sheet of gray, promising heavy snow before nightfall. Inside, the atmosphere was entirely different. The house was practically vibrating with a chaotic, frantic energy. Vanessa was in full command mode, behaving less like a hostess preparing for the holidays and more like a tyrannical general preparing for a military siege. Her family, 30 of the most entitled, demanding people I had ever had the displeasure of meeting, was scheduled to arrive in exactly 48 hours. And the impending invasion had turned my formerly peaceful home into a high-stress war zone. I sat in my leather armchair near the fireplace observing the spectacle with the quiet detachment of a spectator watching a slow-motion car crash. Vanessa was pacing back and forth across the living room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors. She had a tablet in one hand and a clipboard in the other, barking orders at Colin, who was scurrying around like a frightened mouse. He was carrying heavy boxes of holiday decorations up from the basement, sweating profusely and looking absolutely miserable. He bumped into a doorway, dropping a box of glass ornaments, and Vanessa immediately shrieked at him, reprimanding his clumsiness in a tone that made me feel a brief, fleeting pang of pity for the boy. But that pity evaporated instantly. He had chosen this life. He had chosen to let her rule him. Her obsession with appearances was reaching a fever pitch. She had hired a professional cleaning service the day before, using the supplementary credit card she believed was still active to scrub the entire house from top to bottom. She had ordered fresh winter floral arrangements to be delivered and placed on every available surface. She was running herself ragged, trying to construct a perfect, flawless illusion of immense wealth and domestic success. She wanted her parents and her siblings to walk through the front doors and believe she was the undisputed queen of a suburban castle. I remained entirely silent, watching her spin her fragile web of lies. I knew that the foundation she was building upon was completely non-existent. The credit card she thought she was using had been systematically throttled. The house she was decorating no longer belonged to me, let alone to her. The heating system she was relying on to keep her guests warm was scheduled for a permanent corporate termination in just 3 days. She was meticulously arranging the deck chairs on a ship that was already halfway underwater. Just before noon, Vanessa finally noticed me sitting quietly by the fire. She stopped her frantic ting and marched directly toward my chair. Her face was flushed with stress, and her eyes were wide with a manic, demanding intensity. She did not say good morning. She did not ask how I was doing. She simply held out a thick, folded piece of heavy paper and shoved it toward my chest. "This is the final updated grocery list," she said, her voice clipped and breathless. "I added a few more things last night after talking to my mother. She decided she wants a specific type of imported smoked salmon for the Christmas Eve appetizer spread, and my uncle strictly drinks a very particular brand of artisanal gin. I need you to go now. Do not wait until tomorrow. The shelves are going to be completely cleared out by the weekend, and I absolutely cannot have my family eating generic brand garbage." I looked at the thick paper in her hand. I could see the dense lines of ink bleeding through the back. It was a manifesto of greed. It was the physical embodiment of her belief that my sole purpose on this earth was to finance her arrogance. A week ago, this list would have angered me. A month ago, it would have sparked a bitter argument. Today, it only brought me a deep, profound sense of genuine amusement. I felt a small chuckle rising in my chest, but I forcefully swallowed it down. I reached out slowly and took the paper from her trembling fingers. I did not open it to read the new additions. I did not need to know what ridiculous expensive items she had piled onto my supposed tab. I simply nodded, keeping my face completely blank, masking the intense satisfaction bubbling just beneath the surface. "I understand, Vanessa," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly agreeable. "You are under a tremendous amount of pressure right now with your family arriving so soon. I will take care of the shopping today. You do not need to worry about a single thing on this list." She let out a long, dramatic exhale, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling, as if my compliance was the absolute bare minimum she expected. "Well, make sure you check the expiration dates on the dairy products," she ordered, turning her back to me immediately. "The last time you bought cream for my coffee, it expired in 3 days. My mother checks everything. I cannot have her complaining about the quality of the food. Also, do not forget to ask the butcher to double wrap the prime rib. I do not want blood leaking all over the inside of the refrigerator before tomorrow. I watched her walk away, shouting another harsh command at Colin, who was now trying to untangle a massive knot of outdoor holiday lights. I looked down at the heavy paper in my hand. I smoothed my thumb over the crisp edge, feeling the expensive stock she had used to print her ridiculous demands. I folded it neatly directly in half, and then in half again, until it was a small, compact square. I slid the folded list into the front pocket of my trousers. I stood up from my comfortable chair, brushing an invisible speck of dust from my knee. I walked calmly to the hallway closet and retrieved my heavy winter coat. I slipped my arms into the sleeves and buttoned it up against the cold. I grabbed my car keys from the small wooden bowl on the entryway table. Vanessa heard the jingle of the keys and called out from the living room, reminding me not to forget the extra bags of ice. I did not answer her. I opened the heavy wooden front door and stepped out into the freezing Ohio air. The cold wind hit my face, but I felt incredibly warm inside. I walked down the driveway toward my reliable sedan. I was not going to the high-end grocery store downtown. I was not going to purchase smoked salmon or artisanal gin. I was going to the bank to withdraw travel cash, and then I was going to enjoy a very quiet, long lunch at a diner across town. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and turned the heater on full blast. The countdown had officially begun, and I was going to savor every single remaining second. I returned to the house later that afternoon, just as the winter sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long gray shadows across the frozen lawn. I had spent the past few hours enjoying a quiet meal and finalizing my travel itinerary. When I unlocked the front door, the house was still vibrating with the frantic, panicked energy Vanessa had been projecting all week. The smell of artificial pine air freshener was thick and suffocating. I did not announce my return. I walked silently up the stairs to my study, leaving them to their chaotic preparations in the living room. In my study, I retrieved the final item I had kept hidden for this exact moment. It was a sleek, vintage leather suitcase I had purchased years ago for a trip Diane and I took to Europe. It was sturdy, elegant, and perfectly suited for a winter retreat. I opened it and packed the last of my essential clothing, my shaving kit, and a few personal items. I snapped the heavy brass locks shut. The sharp metallic click echoed in the empty room, sounding incredibly final. I put on my heavy wool winter coat, adjusted my scarf, and gripped the leather handle of the suitcase. I was ready. I walked out of the study and made my way toward the main staircase. Below me, the foyer was a scene of domestic panic. Vanessa was standing near the entryway, holding her clipboard, furiously tapping her pen against the metal clip. Colin was perched halfway up a stepladder, clumsily attempting to drape a thick garland of artificial greenery over the front door frame. They were both bickering about the placement of the lights, completely absorbed in their shallow, superficial world. I took my first step down the wooden staircase. The solid thud of my leather shoes and the slight creak of the floorboards immediately caught their attention. Colin paused, looking over his shoulder while gripping the ladder. Vanessa stopped tapping her pen. She turned around, her eyes darting from my winter coat down to the heavy leather suitcase resting in my hand. For a brief second, a look of total confusion washed over her carefully painted face. Her brain simply could not process the visual data in front of her. It did not align with the reality she had constructed. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice sharp and laced with irritation. "And where are the groceries? You were supposed to go to the butcher hours ago. Why do you have a suitcase? Are you bringing up old blankets from the basement for the cousins?" I reached the bottom of the staircase and stood on the marble floor of the foyer. I did not set the suitcase down. I kept my posture completely straight, looking at her with absolute calm. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over the room. I looked at Colin, who was gripping the sides of the ladder with white knuckles, and then I looked back at Vanessa. I allowed a genuine warm smile to spread across my face. It was the smile of a man who had successfully finished a massive construction project and was finally walking off the site. "Your family is arriving in exactly 48 hours, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly measured. 30 people. I think that is absolutely wonderful. It is perfect, actually." Vanessa blinked, gripping her clipboard tighter. "What are you talking about? Where is the food, Bruce?" I tightened my grip on the leather handle of my suitcase. "I am going on vacation to Aspen," I told her, letting every single syllable ring through the quiet foyer. "You can cook and clean for your guests. I am not a servant." The reaction was instantaneous and profoundly satisfying to witness. All the color drained from Vanessa's face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The clipboard in her hand dipped slightly as the muscles in her arm went slack. She stared at me as if I had just started speaking a foreign language. Her reality was fracturing right in front of her eyes. "Aspen." She finally stammered, her voice weak and trembling. "What do you mean, Aspen? What about those groceries? What about my parents needing the master suite? You agreed to move to the basement." I nodded, keeping my smile perfectly intact. "The master suite is entirely yours to deal with, Vanessa. As for the groceries, the list you gave me is still folded in my pocket. I highly suggest you leave for the store right now if you want to secure those premium cuts of meat you demanded. The shelves empty out very quickly this time of year." Colin nearly dropped the garland. He scrambled down the ladder, his face flushed with panic. "Dad, wait," he pleaded, stepping toward me with his hands raised. "You cannot just leave us here. We have 30 people coming. We cannot manage all this by ourselves. You have to stay. We need you." "You do not need me, Colin," I replied, looking at my only son with cold, clinical detachment. "You need a maid and a caterer. I am neither of those things. I am a man going on a well-deserved ski trip." Before Colin could formulate another pathetic excuse, a pair of bright headlights swept across the frosted windows of the front door. The crunch of heavy tires rolling over the gravel driveway signaled the arrival of my transportation. I had scheduled a private Blacktown car to take me directly to the airport, and the driver was impeccably on time. I turned away from my son and his wife. I reached for the brass handle of the front door and pulled it open, letting a gust of freezing winter air sweep into the warm foyer. Outside, the sleek black car sat idling in the driveway, with warm exhaust curling into the cold evening sky. The driver stepped out, opening the rear door and waiting patiently for my arrival. I did not look back. I did not offer a final dramatic speech or a bitter farewell. I simply stepped over the threshold, pulling my leather suitcase behind me. The heavy wooden door closed with a solid, resonant thud, leaving Colin and Vanessa frozen in the foyer, surrounded by empty holiday decorations and the terrifying reality of their own incompetence. I slid into the warm leather seat of the town car, instructed the driver to proceed to the airport, and watched the house fade into the distance, feeling nothing but the glorious, absolute silence of freedom. The heavy leather seats of the town car were heated, providing a comforting warmth as the vehicle glided down the icy highway toward the airport. I sat in the quiet luxury of the back seat, watching the bare trees speed past the tinted windows. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I did not open it to look at holiday greetings or read the news. I opened my banking application. I knew exactly what was happening back in my former zip code. The trap I had so carefully engineered was about exactly ready to snap shut. Vanessa had been backed into a corner of her own making. With her 30 demanding relatives arriving in less than 48 hours, and the pantry completely empty, she had absolutely no choice. She could not wait for Colin to do it. She had to brave the freezing cold and march into the luxury supermarket downtown to execute her massive grocery list. I could picture it perfectly. She would have stormed through the automatic sliding doors, grabbing 3 separate shopping carts and barking at a teenage employee to help her push them. She would have aggressively navigated the crowded aisles, piling the carts high, with the oversized prime rib roasts, the imported French brie, the expensive vintage champagne, and the artisanal gin her uncle required. She would have acted like royalty, throwing items into her cart, without even glancing at the price tags, completely secure in the false knowledge that my bank account was footing the bill. I settled deeper into my seat and kept my eyes on the glowing screen of my phone. At exactly 6:45 in the evening, the first notification appeared. It popped up on my screen as a bright red alert from the credit card company. There was an attempted charge of $4,250 at the downtown premium grocer. Right beneath the total amount was the glorious, highly anticipated status update. Declined. I let out a soft, genuine laugh that filled the quiet cabin of the car. The sequence of events unfolding at the grocery store checkout lane was completely predictable. The teenage cashier would have scanned the mountain of luxury food items, bagging them carefully, while the total climbed higher and higher on the digital register. Vanessa would have been standing there examining her manicure or checking her phone completely unfazed. When the final total was announced, she would have nonchalantly handed over the supplementary credit card I had given her months ago. The cashier would have swiped it through the machine. The terminal would have beeped, issuing a harsh, sharp rejection. I knew Vanessa. I knew her pride. When the cashier politely informed her that the card was declined, she would not have apologized. She would have scoffed. She would have confidently told the cashier that the machine was obviously broken and demanded they run it again. My phone vibrated a second time. A new notification appeared. The exact same amount. The exact same status. Declined. I could perfectly envision the absolute panic setting into her chest. The line of wealthy, impatient holiday shoppers stretching out behind her would be shifting uncomfortably. People would be checking their watches and whispering. The pristine, flawless image she fought so desperately to project was publicly shattering in the middle of a crowded supermarket. The cashier would hand the useless plastic card back to her, informing her that she needed another form of payment. She could not abandon 3 carts full of custom-cut meat and rare cheeses. The humiliation of walking away empty-handed in front of her peers would be a fate worse than death for a woman like her. She had no other option. She would have been forced to open her own designer wallet and retrieve her personal credit cards. These were the cards she desperately kept hidden. The cards carrying 24% interest rates and massive rolling balances. She would have to swipe her own plastic, absorbing the catastrophic financial blow right there at the register. 30 minutes later, my town car pulled up to the airport terminal. I paid the driver, checked my luggage, and made my way to the exclusive airline lounge. I ordered a glass of sparkling water, found a quiet corner seat, and placed my phone on the table. It began to vibrate uncontrollably. The screen lit up with incoming calls from Colin. I did not answer. I simply watched the missed calls pile up until they eventually rolled over to voicemail. When the ringing finally stopped, I pressed the button to listen to the messages. The audio quality was distorted by the sheer volume of the screaming in the background. It was Colin. His voice was frantic, breathless, and trembling with panic. "Dad, you need to call me back immediately," he stammered into the receiver. "There is a massive bank error. Vanessa just got back from the store and your card declined. She had to put almost $5,000 on her own credit card, and it completely maxed out her limit. You need to transfer the funds to us right now. Call the bank. Fix this. We do not have the money to pay this off." In the background of the voicemail, I could hear the unmistakable shrill screeching of Vanessa. She was completely hysterical. I could hear the sound of heavy grocery bags being slammed onto the kitchen counters. She was screaming at Colin, calling him useless, demanding to know why my bank had frozen the accounts right before her family arrived. She was throwing a massive destructive tantrum, tearing their fragile marriage apart over a few $1,000s of premium cheese and raw beef. I deleted the voicemail with a single tap of my finger. I did not call the bank. I did not transfer a single penny. I simply turned off my phone, placed it in my jacket pocket, and watched the snow begin to fall on the runway outside the lounge window. The first structural pillar of their false kingdom had completely collapsed, crushing them under its weight. And the most beautiful part of the entire operation was knowing that the true disaster had not even begun. The utility shutoff was still 3 days away. I took a slow, refreshing sip of my water. The holiday season was turning out to be absolutely spectacular. I had been gone for exactly 48 hours. In the mind of a structural engineer, 48 hours is a highly critical measurement of time. It is exactly the duration required for an unmaintained operating system to show its first visible signs of critical stress. For 3 years, I had been the invisible current keeping that massive property functioning. I swept the extensive hardwood floors. I polished the granite countertops. I emptied the heavy trash bins before they overflowed, and I kept the ambient temperature perfectly regulated. Without my daily physical interventions, the house was a rapidly deteriorating ecosystem. Colin and Vanessa lacked the fundamental discipline to maintain a property of that magnitude. I knew the large porcelain sink was already piling up with dirty dishes from their panicked meals. I knew the garbage bags were swelling and leaking in the kitchen, because neither of them possessed the foresight to drag the heavy bins down the long, icy driveway before the storm hit. The invasion began promptly at 3 in the afternoon. I knew this because my security camera application, which I had conveniently left active on my mobile device while sitting comfortably in my Aspen Lodge, alerted me to the motion at the front door. I watched the silent black and white footage from thousands of miles away while sipping a warm cup of coffee. A massive fleet of rental cars and aggressive suburban transports swarmed my driveway, parking haphazardly on the frozen grass and completely blocking the sidewalk. The doors swung open and the horde descended. 30 people poured out into the freezing Ohio air, dragging massive rolling suitcases, complaining about the bitter weather, and shouting loudly over one another. It was a chaotic, turbulent swarm of heavy winter coats and deeply entitled attitudes. I watched them bottleneck at the front porch. Vanessa pulled open the heavy wooden door, her face stretched into a frantic, desperate smile. She was wearing a thin luxury sweater, attempting to project the image of a relaxed, wealthy hostess welcoming her loyal subjects to her grand estate. But the harsh reality of the situation immediately crashed down upon her. 30 people stomping through the foyer meant 60 wet, muddy winter boots, dragging melting, dirty snow and road salt directly across the pristine marble tiles I used to mop by hand. The entryway instantly became a filthy, crowded disaster zone. The sheer volume of human bodies overwhelmed the delicate aesthetic she had spent days trying to manufacture. Vanessa had spent her entire adult life seeking the approval of her mother. Her mother was a woman whose primary language was criticism wrapped in passive-aggressive concern. I could perfectly visualize the matriarch stepping into the foyer, removing her expensive leather gloves, and immediately scanning the architecture for flaws. Vanessa had paid a professional cleaning service days ago, but 48 hours of her and Colin living in a state of absolute panic had completely erased that effort. The mother would have run a perfectly manicured finger along the intricate oak wainscoting of the hallway, pulling it back to inspect the fine layer of dust that had already settled there. She would not yell or scream. She would simply sigh a soft, deeply disappointed sound that would cut straight through the fragile ego of her daughter. The guest rooms were the next immediate point of structural failure. Without me there to launder the heavy winter sheets, fold the guest towels, and arrange the pillows, the accommodations were severely lacking. Vanessa had undoubtedly shoved her numerous relatives into the spare rooms and the makeshift office spaces, apologizing profusely for the mess, and likely blaming a fictional domestic staff for taking the holiday off. I listened to the frantic voicemails Colin left me later that evening, detailing the absolute nightmare unfolding in my hallways. He whispered into the phone, hiding in a locked bathroom, begging me to come back, because Vanessa was on the verge of a total nervous breakdown. Her aunt was loudly complaining that the cheap air mattresses were deflating on the cold hardwood floors, leaving her to sleep on the rigid wood. Her younger cousins were fighting aggressively over the single shared bathroom in the East Wing because the hot water tank could not possibly keep up with a dozen people attempting to shower back to back. The house simply was not plumbed or designed to operate as a high-capacity hotel, and the infrastructure was failing under the immense sudden load. But the most exquisite failure of the evening occurred in the formal dining room. Vanessa had drained her maximum credit limits at the luxury grocery store, focusing entirely on the premium meats and the artisanal cheeses. She had completely miscalculated the sheer volume of alcohol required to sedate 30 highly critical relatives over a long winter night. Her father, an arrogant, pompous man who considered himself an amateur sommelier, had marched over to the built-in mahogany bar, expecting to find a curated selection of premium spirits. Instead, he found the few cheap bottles of generic table wine Vanessa had desperately grabbed from a corner convenience store to make up the difference when her funds abruptly ran dry. Colin sobbed into his voicemail, describing the scene in excruciating detail. He explained how his father-in-law held up a bottle of $15 blended red wine, examining the cheap metal screw cap with absolute open disgust. The older man turned to the crowded room and loudly asked Vanessa if the logistics firm Colin worked for was facing a potential bankruptcy because serving this kind of offensive swill to family was simply embarrassing. He openly questioned why they were living in such a massive, expensive house if they could not even afford to properly stock a basic liquor cabinet for the holidays. He humiliated his daughter in front of the entire gathering, stripping away the glossy, wealthy veneer she had tried so desperately to paint over her hollow life. I sat by the roaring fireplace in my ski lodge, watching the heavy snow fall over the dark mountains, listening to Colin hyperventilate on the digital recording. The house in Ohio was noisy, crowded, and rapidly becoming unsanitary. The guests were hungry, tired, and highly judgmental of their surroundings. Vanessa was locking herself in the kitchen pantry to cry in secret, and Colin was hiding in the guest bathroom, leaving pathetic messages on the phone of the very man they had tried to banish to a freezing, unfinished basement. The grand illusion of their prosperity was actively cracking under the relentless, brutal scrutiny of the very people they had tried to impress. The structural integrity of their marriage was failing rapidly, and the internal atmospheric pressure was only going to increase as the hours ticked by. The massive weight of 30 ungrateful, demanding guests was pressing down on a foundation built entirely on lies and stolen credit. They were crumbling, and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. And the most magnificent part of the entire situation was knowing that the true catastrophic failure, the absolute freezing termination of their false reality, had not even arrived yet. The winter storm was just beginning. The morning of December 23rd broke over the Ohio Valley with absolute brutality. I watched the national weather broadcast from the comfort of my luxury suite in Aspen, sipping a freshly brewed cup of dark roast coffee. A massive winter system had stalled directly over the Midwest. Heavy, blinding snow was falling at a rate of 2 inches an hour, and the ambient temperature had plummeted into the single digits. The wind chill was severe enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. It was the kind of hostile, unforgiving weather that makes a structurally sound, fully heated home feel like an absolute fortress against nature. But my former home was no longer a fortress. As of 8 o'clock that morning, it was simply a large brick box rapidly losing its thermal mass. I knew the exact moment the trap activated. I had designed the transfer of the utility accounts with the precision of a digital timer. When the clock struck the hour, the automated systems at the regional electric and gas companies processed the finalized legal transfer. My name was officially wiped from the ledger. The new account holder was registered as a commercial demolition and development firm, according to standard corporate safety protocols. Any structure slated for an imminent teardown must have all volatile utilities completely severed to prevent accidental fires or explosions. No human technician needed to visit the property to flip a physical switch. It was all managed remotely through the smart grid. Deep inside the walls of the house, The lifeblood of the property simply stopped flowing. The massive, forced air heating units in the basement powered down and fell completely silent. The glowing digital thermostats in the hallways went entirely black. The pilot lights on the dual water heaters were extinguished. The electricity pulsing through the copper wiring faded, leaving every outlet and overhead fixture entirely dead. The heavy refrigerator filled with Vanessa and her thousands of dollars of premium meats and artisanal cheeses stopped humming. The house did not just lose power, it completely died. I could perfectly envision the sequence of events unfolding within those walls. The 30 arrogant, demanding guests would have been sleeping and taking advantage of the holiday vacation. But a house of that size loses heat remarkably fast when the external temperature is in the single digits. The cold would have seeped through the glass of the large bay windows, crawling across the hardwood floors and creeping up the staircases. The air inside the bedrooms would have turned sharp and biting. One by one, the relatives would have woken up shivering, pulling thin decorative blankets up to their chins. Someone, probably the pompous father-in-law, would have stumbled out of the master suite expecting a hot shower and a freshly brewed cup of premium coffee. He would have turned the brass handle on the shower and found nothing but freezing, icy water shooting from the shower head. He would have marched into the kitchen, flipping light switches in the hallway and finding nothing but heavy, oppressive darkness. The entire horde of guests would have emerged from their respective rooms, wrapped in winter coats over their pajamas, demanding answers, complaining loudly about the freezing conditions and the lack of basic amenities. Colin would have been the primary target of their immediate outrage. Vanessa would have shrieked at him, demanding he fix the problem immediately so she could dry her hair and feed her starving relatives. She would have assumed it was a simple blown fuse or a localized neighborhood power outage. She would have ordered him into the basement to reset the system. I knew exactly what Colin felt when he walked down the wooden stairs into the dark, freezing concrete basement. He would have used the small, weak flashlight on his cellular phone to navigate the space. He would have walked over to the main electrical panel, brushing past the empty walls where my tools used to hang. He would have pulled open the metal door of the breaker box and shined his light on the rows of black plastic switches. He would have expected to see a switch flipped in the wrong direction, but every single switch would have been perfectly aligned. He would have toggled the main breaker off and on, listening for the familiar, comforting hum of the furnace kicking back to life. But the basement would have remained absolutely silent. The silence of a disconnected grid is profound. It is heavy and dead, and it offers no solutions. Standing in the freezing dark, Colin would have realized this was not a simple blown fuse. He would have pulled his phone from his pocket, watching his battery percentage slowly drop in the cold air. He would have dialed the emergency customer service line for the regional electric company. He would have navigated the frustrating automated menus, pressing buttons with trembling fingers, desperate to speak to a human representative. He needed them to dispatch a technician immediately to save him from the wrath of 30 freezing, angry in-laws waiting upstairs. I listened to the exact details of this phone call later that evening through a frantic, highly emotional voicemail Colin left on my blocked number. He had finally reached a customer service representative and aggressively demanded to know why his house was disconnected during a blizzard. He gave them the address and demanded they restore the power immediately. The representative, a calm, professional worker, would have pulled up the account details on their screen. They would have asked for his name and then politely informed him that he was not authorized to make any changes or inquiries regarding that specific address. Colin told me in his tearful message how he had shouted at the woman, claiming he was the son of the owner and that they needed emergency heat. The representative would have maintained her corporate composure. She would have told him that the previous owner, Bruce, had successfully closed the account several days prior. She would have clearly explained that the property was now legally registered to a commercial holding company. And then she would have delivered the final devastating blow that shattered Colin and his entire perception of reality. She would have informed him that the new corporate owner had explicitly requested a total hard termination of all utility services at that address. She would have stated clearly that the property was legally coded as a condemned structure pending immediate commercial demolition. Therefore, no utilities could or would be restored to that location under any circumstances. She advised him to evacuate the premises for his own safety. I sat in Aspen watching the snow fall over the pristine white mountains, sipping my coffee. I could imagine the sheer absolute terror gripping Colin as he stood alone in the dark, freezing basement. Demolition. Corporate owner. Condemned structure. The words would have circled his mind like vultures. The reality of the situation would have crashed down upon him, crushing the breath right out of his lungs. The massive, expensive house he had treated as his own personal free hotel was gone. It had been sold right out from under him while he was sleeping. He had no legal rights. He had no power. He had no heat. How was a broke, unemployed man standing in a freezing basement with a maxed-out credit card, a furious, entitled wife, and 30 aggressive relatives upstairs who were waiting for him to fix a problem that was fundamentally impossible to solve? The structural illusion he and Vanessa had so carefully built to impress their family was not just cracking. It had completely evaporated into thin air. The temperature inside the house was dropping rapidly, but the true chill, the cold, inescapable dread of total ruin had finally reached his bones. The heavy timber beams of the Aspen Ski Lodge stretched high above my head, framing a massive wall of pristine glass. Outside the window, thick white snowflakes drifted lazily down from a bright silver sky, settling softly onto the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Inside the private lounge, the atmosphere was a masterclass in ultimate luxury and total comfort. A colossal stone fireplace dominated the far wall, filled with massive logs of cedar that crackled and popped, radiating a deep, penetrating warmth across the room. I was seated in a plush, oversized leather armchair, resting my feet near the hearth. In my right hand, I held a heavy crystal glass filled with a premium aged beverage, the amber liquid catching the golden light of the fire. Soft instrumental jazz floated from hidden speakers, blending perfectly with the quiet murmur of other wealthy patrons enjoying their winter retreats. I was completely relaxed. My heart rate was slow and steady. I was a man who had successfully navigated a treacherous storm and had finally reached the absolute safety of a distant shore. My mobile phone sat on the polished wooden table next to my chair. For the past hour, the screen had remained completely dark and silent. I knew Colin was likely paralyzed by shock, trapped in that freezing basement, trying to process the catastrophic revelation the utility representative had just handed him. He lacked the fundamental courage to confront me directly after hearing the words condemned and demolition. But I also knew Vanessa possessed no such hesitation. Her entire identity was currently crumbling in front of the very audience she had spent years trying to impress. Her desperation would easily override any sense of caution. Right on schedule, the quiet screen of my phone suddenly illuminated. The device began to vibrate aggressively against the polished wood, sliding slightly across the table. I looked down at the caller identification. It was Vanessa. I did not pick up the phone immediately. I let it vibrate, watching the screen flash her name over and over again. I took a slow, deliberate sip from my crystal glass, letting the rich, warming liquid coat my throat. I savored the absolute control I possessed in this moment. I was the architect holding the only set of blueprints to a building that was currently collapsing around her ears. On the fifth ring, I reached out, picked up the device, and pressed the green button to accept the call. I brought the speaker to my ear, but I did not say a single word. I simply waited for her to initiate the connection. "Bruce!" She shrieked, her voice completely frantic and incredibly shrill. The sheer volume of her forced me to pull the phone a few inches away from my ear. "It is freezing in here. The power is completely out, and the water is like ice. My mother is sitting in the living room wearing 3 winter coats, and my uncle is threatening to book a flight back home." Colin went down to the basement and he is speaking absolute nonsense about the house being scheduled for demolition. You need to call the utility company right now and fix this massive bank error. Give them your credit card number and tell them to turn the heat back on immediately. You are ruining my entire Christmas. You are humiliating me in front of my family. I sat back in my leather chair, listening to the chaotic symphony of destruction playing out in the background of the call. I could hear the unmistakable sound of chattering teeth and shivering bodies. I heard a woman who sounded exactly like her arrogant mother loudly complaining that she could see her own breath in the dining room. I heard the sharp, angry voices of her relatives demanding answers, demanding hot coffee, demanding a warm place to sleep. The entire environment was a toxic, freezing pressure cooker of resentment and blame. And Vanessa was trapped squarely in the center of it, completely powerless to stop the implosion of her carefully crafted social image. I listened to her panting heavily into the receiver. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air as her reality fractured into 1,000 irreparable pieces. She was waiting for me to apologize. She was waiting for me to tell her I was dialing the power company to resolve the issue. She was waiting for the subservient old man to step in and finance her salvation one last time. I swirled the amber liquid in my glass, watching the firelight dance through the crystal. "Vanessa," I said, my voice dropping to a low, calm, and incredibly smooth pitch. The quiet resonance of my tone stood in stark contrast to her hysterical screaming. "There is no bank error, there is no mistake with the billing department, and there is absolutely nothing I can do to restore the heat to that property." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice cracking with mounting terror. "It is your house. You pay the bills. Call them and fix it." "That is where you are fundamentally incorrect," I replied, speaking with the slow, deliberate cadence of a teacher explaining a very simple concept to a very slow student. "I do not pay the bills, and more importantly, I do not own that house anymore. I sold the entire property to a commercial real estate developer for a pure cash transaction. The final paperwork was signed weeks ago." The line went dead silent. For a few glorious seconds, the only sound was the crackle of the cedar logs in my fireplace, and the faint howling of the Ohio blizzard echoing through her end of the phone. I could practically hear the gears inside her mind grinding together and shattering as the truth finally penetrated her thick wall of denial. "You sold it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the background noise of her complaining relatives. "But we live here. My family is here. Where are we supposed to go?" "That is a logistical problem you will have to solve on your own," I told her, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction wash over my entire being. "The developer assumed total legal control of the utilities this morning. Standard corporate demolition protocol requires a hard shutoff of all volatile services to prevent liability before the bulldozers arrive on the 26th. I cannot call them to turn the heat back on because I have absolutely zero legal authority over that address. You are currently trespassing in a condemned commercial structure." "Bruce, please," she whimpered, the arrogance and entitlement entirely stripped from her voice, replaced by a naked begging desperation. "Please, you cannot do this to us. It is freezing. We have no money to go anywhere else. My parents will never forgive me. Please help us." I looked out the massive glass windows, watching the gentle snow coat the tranquil Aspen Mountains. I thought about the 3 years I had spent scrubbing wine stains off antique rugs. I thought about the thousands of dollars she had stolen from my accounts to buy designer shoes. I thought about the moment she demanded I sleep on a broken metal spring in a damp basement so her parents could sleep in the bed I shared with my late wife. "You demanded the house for the holidays, Vanessa," I said, my tone dropping to a whisper of absolute finality. "I gave it to you. Try not to freeze." I pulled the phone away from my ear, ignoring the frantic, pathetic sobbing that was just beginning to erupt from her throat. I pressed the red button and ended the call, permanently severing the connection. The screen went dark. I opened my device settings, navigating directly to the contact management menu. I selected Vanessa and tapped the option to block her number. I scrolled down to Colin and did the exact same thing. I locked the device and placed it face down on the polished wooden table. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full and rich and incredibly satisfying. It was the sound of a perfectly designed structural collapse executing exactly according to the blueprints. I leaned my head against the soft leather backing of my chair and raised my crystal glass toward the roaring fire, offering a silent toast to Diane. The winter storm in Ohio was going to be terribly brutal tonight, but inside my lodge the temperature was absolutely perfect. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a brilliant, blinding sunlight, reflecting off the heavy layers of fresh snow. In Aspen, I woke up feeling entirely refreshed and completely rested. I ordered a generous room service breakfast and poured myself a hot cup of dark coffee. I walked over to the massive windows of my suite and took a seat at the small glass table. I opened my tablet and launched the security application. I had strategically left the high-definition exterior and entryway cameras perfectly active and connected to a dedicated cellular backup line. I wanted to witness the final structural collapse with perfect clarity. The digital feed from Ohio loaded onto my screen. The neighborhood was buried under 2 feet of snow. My former driveway was a chaotic frozen parking lot filled with the rental vehicles of 30 furious, shivering relatives. The windows of the brick house were completely frosted over from the inside, a clear indication that the interior temperature was hovering dangerously close to freezing. I watched the timestamp on the bottom corner of the screen tick forward. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Right on schedule, a heavy white commercial utility truck equipped with a snowplow turned onto the street. It was followed closely by a sleek black corporate vehicle. They rolled slowly past the snowed-in rental cars and parked directly at the base of the driveway. The doors of the black vehicle opened first. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out into the freezing air. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, a perfectly tailored suit, and carried a thick metal clipboard. This was the commercial property manager employed by the luxury development firm. He moved with the rigid, uncompromising authority of a man who dealt exclusively in million-dollar contracts and strict corporate timelines. I was not alone. From the white utility truck, 3 more men emerged. 2 of them were massive, imposing private security contractors, wearing thick black tactical jackets and heavy boots. They looked like professional enforcers hired to ensure absolute compliance. The third man carried a heavy leather tool belt slung over his shoulder. He was a commercial locksmith brought in to drill out the old locks and secure the perimeter of the condemned structure. The 4 men marched up the icy walkway, moving in a tight, synchronized formation. They did not look like holiday visitors. They looked like an eviction squad. I turned up the volume on my tablet, listening through the crisp audio feed of the porch camera. The property manager stepped up to the heavy wooden front door. He did not search for the doorbell. He raised his gloved hand and delivered 4 loud, aggressive knocks against the solid wood. The sound echoed sharply in the freezing morning air. It was a heavy, demanding sound that carried the full weight of legal authority. For a full minute, nothing happened. The property manager looked at his clipboard, verifying the address, and knocked again, this time even louder. Finally, the brass handle slowly turned. The heavy door pulled open just a few inches. Vanessa stood in the doorway, and the sight of her was absolutely glorious. The arrogant, perfectly manicured woman who had demanded premium champagne and imported cheeses was entirely gone. In her place stood a shivering, miserable figure. She was wrapped tightly in a thick, ugly sleeping bag, wearing a pair of dirty sweatpants and 3 layers of mismatched sweaters. Her hair was a tangled, greasy mess. Her face was pale, and her lips had a distinct bluish tint from spending the entire night trapped in a freezing house. She looked exactly like what she had become, a desperate squatter. She asked if she could help them, her voice shaking uncontrollably from the bitter cold. The property manager looked at her with an expression of absolute corporate detachment. He did not offer a warm holiday greeting. He glanced down at the documents attached to his metal clipboard and then looked back at Vanessa. He stated, his voice booming clearly through the microphone, that he was the regional director for the commercial development group. He announced he was looking for the previous owner to conduct the final pre-demolition walkthrough. Vanessa gripped the edge of the door, her knuckles turning white. She stammered, her teeth audibly chattering that the previous owner was not there. She claimed he went on vacation and that they were his family, staying there for Christmas. The property manager frowned, stepping closer to the threshold. The two massive security guards moved up right behind him, crossing their arms over their broad chests. They loomed over Vanessa, casting a dark, intimidating shadow across the entryway. The manager said, his tone dropping into a hard, uncompromising register, that her claim was completely impossible. He explained this property was officially sold and legally transferred to a corporate holding company. He clarified the previous owner surrendered all rights to the location, and the utility accounts were terminated according to standard safety protocols. He stated firmly that the structure was officially classified as a condemned commercial site and scheduled for a total demolition in exactly 48 hours. He raised his clipboard, pointing a gloved finger at the bold printed text on the top page. He declared he had a demolition crew arriving on the 26th and was informed the property was entirely vacant. Yet he was standing there looking at a driveway full of vehicles and a house full of unauthorized individuals. Vanessa opened her mouth, but no words materialized. Her eyes darted from the stern property manager to the intimidating security guards and finally to the locksmith, who was already inspecting the brass hardware on the front door. The absolute finality of the situation was crushing the air out of her lungs. The manager demanded taking another step forward and forcing Vanessa to retreat slightly into the freezing foyer to know exactly who she was. He demanded to know why 30 unauthorized squatters were currently residing in a condemned commercial building without power, water, or legal permission to be on the premises. The word squatters echoed through the audio feed, ringing with beautiful, poetic justice. She was no longer a wealthy hostess. She was no longer the queen of a suburban castle. She had been officially reduced to a nameless, faceless trespasser by a man holding a clipboard. Vanessa cried out, her voice cracking under the immense pressure, that they were not squatters. She insisted this was her father-in-law's house and that they lived there. She pleaded that her entire family was inside and they were freezing. The property manager did not show a single ounce of pity. He simply shook his head and pulled a thick packet of legal documents from beneath the clip of his board. He said, coldly holding the papers up for her to see, that her father-in-law did not own the house. He stated his corporation owned the house. He told her she had no lease, she had no legal rights, and she was trespassing on a highly dangerous commercial construction site. I sat back in my plush armchair in Aspen, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my coffee. The first domino had been pushed, and the entire false reality she had built for her critical judging relatives was about to shatter publicly in the middle of her freezing living room. The final eviction had officially commenced. The freezing wind whipped through the open front door, blowing a fine mist of snow into the marble foyer. I leaned closer to the glowing screen of my tablet, watching the high-definition security feed with absolute fascination. Vanessa was trembling uncontrollably, wrapped in her dirty sleeping bag, staring at the property manager as if he were an executioner. The harsh reality of her situation was finally crashing down upon her, but the true public execution of her pride had not even started. From the depths of the freezing house, loud, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Vanessa shrank back as her father marched into the entryway. He was a large, pompous man who had spent the entire previous evening loudly bragging to his siblings and cousins about the massive estate his successful daughter had purchased. He was wearing a heavy wool coat over his pajamas, his face red with a mixture of cold and profound irritation. He stepped up behind Vanessa, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder and glaring at the men standing on the porch. He demanded to know what was going on and why the front door was standing wide open, letting in the freezing air. He puffed out his chest, looking directly at the property manager, and loudly announced that this was his daughter and son-in-law private home. He threatened to call the police if the men did not leave their property immediately. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my coffee in Aspen. The arrogant father had just walked perfectly into the trap. The property manager did not flinch. He did not back down. He simply looked at the older man with an expression of cold corporate amusement. He stated very clearly, so that his voice carried down the hallway and into the crowded living room, that this was absolutely not her home. He announced that this property belonged to a commercial development firm and that everyone currently inside the structure was trespassing. The father let out a loud, arrogant laugh, waving his hand dismissively. He insisted that there must be some kind of clerical error, because his daughter Vanessa and her husband Colin had recently bought this massive suburban estate. He turned to Vanessa, expecting her to agree with him and order the men off the porch. But Vanessa could not speak. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, her face buried in the folds of her sleeping bag, shivering from something much deeper than the winter cold. Just then, Colin emerged from the basement stairwell, dragging his feet like a condemned man walking to the gallows. He looked completely defeated, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of total despair. He walked into the foyer, stepping up beside his humiliated wife and his confused father-in-law. The property manager looked down at his clipboard, verifying a name, and then looked directly at my son. The manager asked if he was Colin. Colin nodded weakly, his voice barely a whisper. The manager reached into the thick leather portfolio under his arm. He pulled out a heavy stack of legal documents printed on crisp white paper and bound by a thick blue legal clip. He did not hand them over politely. He shoved the heavy stack of papers directly into Colin's chest, forcing him to take them. The manager announced loudly that he was officially serving them with a 24-hour notice of eviction. He stated that the attached documents contained the final deed of sale signed and executed by the actual legal owner, Bruce. He clarified that the property was sold in a cash transaction weeks ago, and that Colin and Vanessa had absolutely no lease, no ownership, and zero legal rights to occupy the premises. The silence in the foyer was absolute. The pompous father stared at the legal documents resting in Colin's trembling hands. The color began to drain rapidly from the older man's face. He turned to his daughter, his voice dropping its arrogant edge and replacing it with a tone of rising panic. He asked Vanessa what the man was talking about. He demanded to know if they owned the house. Behind them, the remaining 28 relatives had slowly gathered in the hallway and the living room, drawn by the commotion at the front door. They were all huddled in heavy coats and blankets, shivering in the freezing house, listening to every single word. The aunts, the uncles, the cousins who had spent the last 2 days being bossed around by Vanessa were now watching her entire fake empire crumble into dust. Colin looked down at the documents, his eyes scanning the first page. He saw my signature. He saw the sale price. He saw the strict transfer dates. He closed his eyes and let out a pathetic, broken sob. He confessed to the entire room that they did not own the house. He admitted that it was my house and that I had sold it right out from under them without saying a single word. The reaction from the gathered family was instantaneous and brutal. The whispers erupted into a loud, chaotic chorus of absolute shock and mounting anger. An aunt from the back of the room shouted that they had flown across the country to stay in a stolen house. An uncle loudly complained that they were freezing to death in a condemned building because Vanessa wanted to play pretend. The illusion of wealth and success was completely shattered, leaving nothing but the pathetic reality of two broke, entitled adults who had driven away the only man who ever truly supported them. Vanessa covered her face with her hands, sobbing hysterically into the fabric of her sleeping bag. Her father took a massive step away from her, looking at his daughter with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound embarrassment. He had spent months bragging to his golf buddies and business associates about the massive estate his successful daughter owned. He realized in that exact moment that he had been boasting about a lie. He realized his daughter was nothing more than a parasite who had been living off the generosity of an old man she treated like garbage. The property manager stood on the porch, completely unfazed by the family drama unfolding before him. He pointed a gloved finger at Colin and delivered his final devastating instruction. He stated that they had exactly 24 hours to pack their belongings and vacate the premises. He warned that if the house was not entirely empty by 9 o'clock the following morning, he would return with the local police to begin making arrests for criminal trespassing. He turned around and walked back down the icy driveway, followed closely by the locksmith and the two massive security guards. They climbed back into their vehicles and drove away, leaving the front door wide open. The freezing winter wind howled into the foyer, sweeping across the polished marble floor. Colin and Vanessa stood frozen in the entryway, completely exposed and utterly defenseless, under the furious, judgmental stares of their 30 freezing relatives. I watched them from my warm, luxurious sanctuary in Aspen, feeling a deep, profound sense of ultimate satisfaction. The structural collapse was complete. There was absolutely nothing left of their false kingdom but rubble. The heavy wooden door stood wide open, letting the brutal Ohio blizzard sweep directly into the grand foyer. The property manager had delivered his 24-hour ultimatum and walked away, leaving behind an absolute vacuum of authority. That vacuum was immediately filled by the furious, indignant rage of Vanessa's humiliated family. I leaned forward in my leather chair in Aspen, watching the security feed with rapt attention. The initial shock that had paralyzed the 30 relatives completely evaporated and was instantly replaced by a frantic, desperate need to escape the condemned structure. Vanessa's father was the first to break the silence. He turned his back on his daughter, completely ignoring her pathetic sobbing. He loudly announced to the entire gathering that they were leaving immediately. He stated he would not spend another minute freezing in a stolen house while his own daughter played a sick, delusional game of pretend. His voice echoed up the grand staircase, acting as a starting pistol for the mass exodus. The relative stampede began. Aunts, uncles, and cousins scrambled back up the stairs, rushing to the guest bedrooms to retrieve their belongings. Through the internal hallway cameras, I watched the absolute chaos unfold. The carefully arranged holiday illusion was torn to shreds in minutes. Suitcases were thrown open on top of the unmade beds. Clothes and toiletries were shoved hastily into canvas bags. The cheap, deflated air mattresses were abandoned on the hardwood floors. Nobody cared about packing neatly. They only cared about evacuating the freezing, dark house before the situation deteriorated any further. Down in the foyer, Vanessa tried frantically to do damage control. She shuffled from relative to relative, wrapped tightly in her dirty sleeping bag, begging them to wait. She pleaded with her cousins, trying to formulate a ridiculous lie about a bank error and a misunderstanding with the real estate developer. But her family was entirely done listening to her lies. Her uncle pushed past her, dragging a heavy rolling suitcase, and loudly told her to get out of his way. Her cousins ignored her completely, refusing to even make eye contact as they carried their bags down the stairs. The absolute disdain they held for her was palpable through the silent video feed. Her father stood in the center of the living room, furiously tapping on his cellular phone. The massive driveway was completely snowed in and packed tightly with their frozen rental cars, making it impossible for them to drive themselves out. Instead, he was coordinating a massive emergency evacuation using a premium ride-share application. He booked a fleet of large sport utility vehicles to transport his massive family to a luxury hotel downtown. He was using his own wealth to rescue his relatives from the catastrophic disaster his daughter had orchestrated. Within 20 minutes, the first black vehicles began arriving on the snow-covered street outside. The family marched toward the front door, wrapping their heavy winter coats tightly around their bodies. They dragged their luggage across the marble tiles, leaving long streaks of dirty, melted snow in their wake. They did not say goodbye to Colin. My son was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, his head buried in his hands, entirely paralyzed by his impending ruin. He had completely shut down, completely unable to process the magnitude of his failure. As the last few relatives filed out the front door, Vanessa made one final desperate attempt to salvage her most important relationship. She reached out and grabbed her mother by the arm. The matriarch of the family, a woman whose entire existence revolved around social status and pristine public image, stopped in the doorway. Vanessa sobbed openly, begging her mother for financial help, begging for a place to stay, begging for forgiveness. She asked her mother to pay for a hotel room for her and Colin so they would not freeze to death on the street. The mother looked at Vanessa with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She did not offer a warm, maternal embrace. She did not offer a word of comfort. She pulled her arm away from her daughter with a sharp, aggressive motion. She spoke with a cold, calculating precision that cut through the freezing air. She told Vanessa that she was a profound, massive embarrassment to their entire family. She stated that Vanessa had humiliated them in front of their extended relatives, dragging them to a condemned freezing house just to satisfy her own pathetic vanity. Then the mother delivered the final crushing blow. She explicitly ordered Vanessa not to contact them for the remainder of the holiday season. She told her daughter that she and Colin created this disastrous mess entirely on their own, and that they would have to find a way to survive the consequences without a single dime of family money. She turned around, stepped out onto the snowy porch, and climbed into the waiting vehicle without looking back a single time. The heavy sport utility vehicles pulled away from the curb, their red taillights disappearing into the thick white snowstorm. The street fell completely silent. The massive exodus was officially complete. Inside the house, Colin and Vanessa were left entirely alone. They were standing in the freezing dark foyer surrounded by the muddy footprints of their departed guests and the shattered remnants of their false reality. They had absolutely no money in their bank accounts. Their credit cards were completely maximized. Their family had abandoned them in disgust, and they had exactly 23 hours left to pack their entire lives into cardboard boxes before the police arrived to arrest them for criminal trespassing. I reached out and gently tapped the screen of my tablet, closing the security application. The performance was over, and the ending was absolutely flawless. I sat back in my armchair, feeling the deep, comforting warmth of the fireplace washing over my face. I had designed a structural collapse of immense proportions, and it had executed with brilliant mathematical perfection. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my aged scotch, entirely at peace. A full week had passed since the eviction. 7 glorious, uninterrupted days of absolute tranquility. I was sitting on the private terrace of my Aspen Lodge, breathing in the crisp mountain air and reading a novel I had neglected for years. My phone sat quietly on the small glass table next to my coffee. I had unblocked Colin's number earlier that morning. Not because I was ready to forgive him, but because a structural engineer always needs to verify that the demolition was completely successful. Right on schedule, the phone began to vibrate against the glass. I let it ring 3 times before slowly picking up the device and answering the call without saying a single word. The audio quality on the other end of the connection was absolutely pathetic. Through the speaker, I could hear the distinct muffled sounds of a cheap roadside motel. A police siren wailed faintly in the distance, and a heavy commercial truck rumbled past, rattling the thin windows of wherever my son was hiding. In the background, I could clearly hear Vanessa crying. It was not her usual theatrical sobbing meant to manipulate an audience. It was the hollow, exhausted weeping of a woman who had finally run out of options. Colin took a ragged, trembling breath. He spoke my name, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his new reality. He sounded completely broken, stripped of every ounce of the arrogant entitlement he had worn like a crown just 7 days prior. He started begging, immediately pouring out a frantic stream of apologies and excuses. He told me that they had been forced to spend their last remaining dollars on a filthy motel room just off the interstate. He confessed that their bank accounts were entirely overdrawn and their credit cards were completely maximized. He explained that his luxury vehicle was on the verge of being repossessed because he had missed 3 consecutive lease payments. He sobbed into the receiver, pleading with me to wire them just enough money to secure a small apartment. He promised he would pay me back every single cent. He swore he would find a second job. He begged me to remember that he was my only son and that I could not simply leave him to rot in a dangerous roadside motel. I sat in the morning sunlight, listening to his desperate unraveling with complete emotional detachment. I did not feel a single pang of guilt or parental obligation. I waited for him to completely exhaust his lungs and fall silent. When the line was finally quiet, I spoke with a calm, measured precision. I told him that my role as his personal automated teller machine officially terminated the exact moment he allowed his wife to treat me like a domestic servant in the home I built with his mother. I reminded him of the morning he sat at my dining table and cowered behind his plate while Vanessa exiled me to a broken spring mattress in a freezing basement. I explained that an adult man must bear the full, unmitigated weight of his own decisions. Colin tried to interrupt, attempting to formulate another pathetic excuse, but I did not allow him to speak. I told him that I had spent the last 3 years quietly absorbing their disrespect while secretly financing their absolute vanity. I stated clearly that the financial pipeline was permanently severed and no amount of begging would ever reconnect it. I advised him to swallow his pride, walk into the nearest retail store, and apply for a minimum wage position because hard physical labor was the only thing that could possibly repair his deeply flawed character. I told him this was my final communication and that any future attempts to contact me would be handled directly by my legal counsel. He let out a loud, agonizing cry, begging me not to hang up the phone. I did not listen to the rest of his sentence. I pulled the device away from my ear and pressed the button, dropping the call into total silence. I immediately opened my settings and permanently blocked his number, ensuring he could never breach my peace again. The final tie was officially cut. They were entirely on their own, forced to navigate the brutal, unforgiving reality of extreme debt and manual labor. I set the phone face down on the table, leaned back in my chair, and took a deep, fulfilling breath of the fresh winter air. Exactly 1 month later. The brutal freezing. Ohio blizzard feels like nothing more than a distant, faded nightmare. I am currently sitting on a massive wrap-around balcony high above the sparkling turquoise waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The warm tropical Florida sun is beating down on my face, carrying the gentle, soothing scent of salt and blooming hibiscus on the morning breeze. There are no snowplows scraping the asphalt down below. There are no frantic phone calls about broken heaters or utility shutoffs. There is only the rhythmic, calming sound of ocean waves crashing against the pristine white sand. I purchased this ultra-luxury penthouse condominium entirely in cash, using merely a fraction of the millions generated from the swift sale of the Ohio property. The transition was flawless. I take a slow, deep sip of my dark roast coffee, allowing the rich, robust flavor to linger on my tongue. The ceramic mug rests on a sleek glass patio table entirely free of sticky vanilla espresso stains. Inside the condominium, the floor-to-ceiling windows let the brilliant sunlight wash over immaculate imported marble floors. There are no unwashed dishes piling up in my state-of-the-art kitchen. There are no loud, obnoxious dinner parties rattling the walls on a Tuesday night. The air in my home is perfectly clean, perfectly regulated, and perfectly mine. I think back to the damp, freezing, unfinished basement where my daughter-in-law had so casually attempted to banish me. I think of the broken metal spring on that ancient pull-out couch. The contrast between that proposed exile and my current reality is simply magnificent. I have successfully reclaimed my absolute sovereignty. Resting on the glass table right next to my coffee mug is a small, polished silver frame containing a photograph of Diane. It is the picture we took on our 30th wedding anniversary. She is smiling that radiant, beautiful smile with her dark hair blowing gently in the wind. I reach out and gently trace the smooth edge of the metal frame. Some narrow-minded people might argue that by selling the house we built together, I somehow abandoned her memory or destroyed our family legacy. But looking at her smiling face in the warm morning light, I know the exact opposite is true. I honored her memory in the most profound and protective way possible. Diane and I did not spend 4 decades working ourselves to the bone, saving every spare penny and sacrificing our own personal luxuries just to finance the ungrateful vanity of a spoiled daughter-in-law and a spineless, cowardly son. We built our wealth to provide a foundation of security and comfort, not to create a bottomless slush fund for parasitic entitlement. By tearing down that physical structure and securing our financial assets, I protected everything Diane and I actually stood for. I protected our dignity. I protected our life work from being systematically looted by two adults who absolutely refused to respect the very hands that fed them. I leaned back into my plush lounge chair, closing my eyes and tilting my face upward toward the brilliant morning sun. The absolute silence of the penthouse is the most beautiful symphony I have ever heard in my entire life. It is a thick, rich, heavy silence completely unbothered by selfish demands, unbothered by petty manipulation, and entirely unbothered by parental guilt. I spent my entire professional career engineering massive structures designed to bear the heavy weight of the world. But today, sitting on this balcony, I am carrying absolutely no weight at all. My foundation is completely solid. My personal boundaries are permanently reinforced. I am a wealthy, dignified man enjoying the quiet, spectacular peace of a highly successful extraction. The most profound lesson to take away from this entire experience is that unconditional love does not ever require unconditional financial enabling. True family is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, sincere gratitude, and shared responsibility, not on toxic manipulation and entitled demands. When you allow someone to repeatedly disrespect you in your own home while happily spending your hard-earned money, you are not helping them grow into better people. You are simply financing their corruption and paying for your own abuse. Sometimes the absolute greatest act of self-respect and the most effective way to teach a grown child a vital life lesson is to firmly walk away and let them face the brutal reality of the real world entirely on their own. If you found satisfaction in this story of reclaiming personal dignity and setting unbreakable boundaries, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one.